Discomfort is The Last of Us Part 2's name of the game.
I'm pregnant. Oh my God.
From the violence and gore and body horror imagery, to the brutal plot decisions and moral tightrope audiences are asked to walk, The Last of Us 2 was a title that never let up when it came to dashing even the slightest ray of pleasure. And this was always the point. In a story dedicated to exploring the senseless cycle of violence, it makes sense then that the narrative around the message would also seek to dissatisfy.
I became really intrigued with the idea of the cycle of violence. It's almost never satisfying. It never brings the person you love back. And despite you thinking it's going to bring some closure, it doesn't.
That feeling of discomfort, it's exactly what we're trying to explore with The Last of Us.
When watching the newly released behind-the-scenes documentary, it's clear that Druckmann and the Naughty Dog creative team placed a real importance on keeping things as close to reality as possible, not shying away from the horrors of real violence as they sought to recreate lifelike depictions of blood sprays and body mutilation. But Druckmann's desire for the uncomfortable wouldn't be bound to just the game's violence, but to the story being told as well.
Please get up!
The story of The Last of Us 2, or rather the way the story was told, was shocking, as it employed storytelling techniques specifically designed to jolt the audience out of immersion.
I'm not doing this. I'm good. Fuck this.
Despite the game's initial anticipation, The Last of Us 2 came under community fire when it eventually dropped on June 19, 2020, with some calling out the story's potential political agenda, while others disapproved of certain story beats, like the murder of Joel Miller, the beloved protagonist from The Last of Us Part 1, whose death in Part 2 would ultimately lay down the building blocks for the rest of the story. But undeniably, the largest community uproar was due to a moment at the halfway point, when players were suddenly forced to stop playing as the story's hero, Ellie, and begin playing as the story's antagonist and Joel's murderer, Abby.
Dude, I am so conflicted.
I do not like playing as this person.
No. You do not know.
The whiplash of the story moment would go down in history as one of the more divisive narrative decisions in a video game, as reports began surfacing that told of players feeling so much dissonance between themselves and what the game was asking them to do, that they put the controllers down and never looked back. Communities even went so far as to petition to have the story altered, with over 55,000 people signing in the hopes of having the pain points removed. This would, uncoincidentally, coincide with one of the internet's largest discussions around video game narrative structure, as many writers and critics took to the keyboards to pick apart The Last of Us 2's storytelling. So why was this moment so uncomfortable? What is the anatomy of this storytelling decision? Well, for this moment, Druckmann and the creative team employed an unusual theatrical technique called the alienation technique, or distancing effect, a theatrical technique popularized by German playwright Bertolt Brecht, who in the early 1930s revolutionized the theater when he began to reevaluate the audience's role during plays. To Brecht, the modern theatrical landscape had become complacent, with dramatic theater only serving to provide temporary escapism, instead of using its unique position to activate the audience's ability to learn, reflect, and think critically on a subject, values he saw as important for the current political climate. From here, Brecht would go on to develop a style of theatre later coined as epic theatre, a response to classic dramatic theatre that aimed to use immersion-breaking theatrical techniques in order to keep the audience at an emotional distance from empathetically identifying with the characters. During his plays, audiences were continually jolted out of immersion when lights would suddenly flood the entire theatre, exposing the audience, or actors would begin delivering lines in song and dance, or begin reading stage directions out loud. Not so subtle reminders to audiences to remain above the story as a disconnected observer. Much like The Last of Us 2, Brecht's new approach to theatre was met with mixed reviews, with some praising it for its freshness, while others dismissing its anti-illusionist dramaturgy as over-intellectualized political nonsense. But to Brecht, this was all a success. In Brecht's words, don't expect the theatre to satisfy the habits of its audience, but to change them. Decades later, his philosophies would see a resurgence as a renewed interest in social and political issues swept through post-war America, going on to influence artists like Andy Warhol, Banksy, and Hideo Kojima.
Raiden, Turn the game console off right now.
What did you say?
The mission is a failure. Cut the power right now.
What's wrong with you?
Don't worry, it's a game. It's a game just like usual.
You'll ruin your eyes playing so close to the TV.
When it comes to Brecht philosophies and video games, developers have been jolting audiences back to the Outer Rims for decades.
I see that you enjoy Konami games.
Metal Gear Solid did it when Psycho Mantis read the player's memory card.
Stanley took the first open door on his left.
The Stanley Parable was a game built around acknowledging the player and their choice making.
Stanley was so bad at following directions, it's incredible he wasn't fired years ago.
And the humor of Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts is built around acknowledging the player's expectation of certain video game tropes.
Toss your weapon!
And then there's The Last of Us 2.
You killed my friends.
When it used the sudden perspective shift to jolt audiences into discomfort.
This is so stupid. I don't want to see her f***ing side. I don't want to see her f***ing shitty justification for how she is.
So here's the question. What did The Last of Us 2 do so differently to warrant such a negative response? After all, this isn't the first time a game has employed this use of a character switch-up.
What would you have your Arbiter do?
Bungie's Halo 2 did it in 2004 when, after a few hours into the story, players suddenly took control of the Arbiter, a member of the enemy alien race responsible for hundreds of human deaths, but was met with overwhelming player approval. Well, ironically, the difference in The Last of Us 2 would be the use of a tool that Brecht was actively trying to eradicate in his plays: empathy. To Brecht, empathy was a human emotion considered to be useless when it came to absorbing the message behind a story. According to Brecht, whoever empathizes with someone and does so completely relinquishes criticism both of the object of their empathy and of themselves. Instead of awakening, they sleepwalk. But Druckmann and the creative team would evolve this idea and actively harness the use of empathy to make their jolt moment more impactful.
We just need more empathy. Wouldn't it be awesome if we could create an experience that lets you safely explore those feelings?
In The Last of Us 2, there were always two perspectives, and Druckmann and the team could have structured the story similar to other mediums by continually jumping between each character. But instead, the team chose to stick with the entirety of Ellie's half first, to align players empathetically while at the same time building up the snowball of hate for Abby. The nail in the coffin for establishing this hate was hammered in only moments before the Brecht moment, when Abby killed off yet another one of Ellie's friends, Jesse, right before her eyes.
Jesse, stand up!
And then, the jolt moment, where players switched characters and the figurative theater was flooded with light, awakening and exposing and forcing players to look at things from a new perspective.
You're gonna make me fucking play as her after she kills Joel and Jesse.
As a species addicted to connection, this was a punish.
Fuck this shit!
But if Druckmann's intention was to use this discomfort to jolt audiences to action, then The Last of Us 2 might just be a resounding success, as communities launched into hundreds upon hundreds of passionate discussions around social, political, and narrative subjects, with many advocating for both sides of the argument.
I says to you, there's no good thing that comes out of revenge, and all we're doing is proving that both sides are exactly the same.
And so, The Last of Us 2, even though it harnessed empathy instead of eradicating it, might be a story experience Brecht would be proud of. After all, much like Brecht and his distancing effect, The Last of Us 2 never set out to satisfy the habits of its audience, but to change them.
This video is sponsored by Death Trick Double Blind, a non-linear detective visual novel out now on Steam and Nintendo Switch.
that was just a bit unsatisfying.